Whether you call it the butterfly effect, luck, coincidence, happenstance, or some other term, most people have some awareness of the changing tides of long-term cause and effect. But what if I told you that the careers and successes of hundreds of NBA players hinged on the bounce of a single ping pong ball on a single night 33 years ago? What if I told you further still that it's actually 33 years and counting? This is what you don't know about the trade that never ends. Welcome to What You Don't Know About Sports, where we delve into the forgotten stories, teams, and athletes of sports history and question widely held takes on today's sports. I'm Matt, and this is Blake.
Hi.
Today, I want to tell you about something that we stumbled upon, just a fact that we stumbled upon that sent me down a rabbit hole of researching a trade chain, which we'll talk about what that is a little bit later, that involves the 1993 NBA draft. Blake, I have a question for you before we get started. What is your favorite or most memorable trade?
For the record, I don't know where he's going with this, everyone. So I'm just as excited as you are. But since we're talking about a trade, probably, I'm assuming that this trade from started at the 1993 draft was quite impactful in some way. And the most recent biggest trade that I could think of was Anthony Davis to the Lakers, who went for three players and three three first-round draft picks, because that basically set up last year's champion. And LeBron's going to play until his son is in the NBA, which is a good 3 years from now. So the NBA is better when the Lakers are good, in my opinion. So I can appreciate it. It's very lasting. I actually think the Pelicans have a pretty good young core down there too. So hopefully they can do some cool stuff too in the near future. But yeah, I would say Anthony Davis. And because I don't have a single team in the NBA that I root for, I'm not really emotionally invested, but I would say that's one of the more memorable ones.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one just in recent memory. I think the one that always gets brought up is like the Herschel Walker trade in the NFL. I hate them, but they did well for themselves over there in Dallas. But yeah, that's the one I always go with. If you're wondering what a trade chain is, it's just where you follow a series of events, a series of transactions, like Blake just mentioned, Anthony Davis going to the Lakers for a bunch of stuff, like three players and a couple of draft picks, I think. And it's following what each side does with those pieces. Do they keep them? Do they let them go in free agency, at which point it's over? Do they trade them for something else? And do they trade those people for something else, right? It's following the loose ends. So without further ado, let's get to one that's lasted for 33 years. And I'm going to set it up for you, and then we're going to look at some of the wild pieces that are involved. So in the 1992-93 season, the Orlando Magic were coming off a 500 season in just their fourth year in existence. The year prior, they had drafted Shaquille O'Neal. They beat their expansion brethren, the Hornets, for him in the 1992 lottery. If you're ever wondering if a great player was picked in the draft, there's a good chance that Charlotte picked soon after.
The very next pick after, multiple times.
Multiple times. It just is this way.
You just can't help it.
They can't. They had Shaq, but they also had pieces that would be important. We all know that they make a finals run. They featured heavily in the Last Dance documentary that we all binged on during the pandemic. they had those pieces. Nick Anderson, Dennis Scott. They had a young Steve Kerr on that team. All these pieces were in place, but they had just missed the playoffs. 41-41, just missed the cutoff, so they're in the lottery. At the same time, the 1992-93 Golden State Warriors were playing good basketball too. They had just had 2 consecutive playoff seasons, had been to the playoffs 3 times in the previous 4 seasons. They had Chris Mullin. They had Tim Hardaway. They were coming off a rookie performance from Latrell Sprewell, who, past choking out his coach, was a solid NBA player. But that season, Chris Mullin was hurt, and so they too were in the lottery. And we see this from time to time where good teams have dudes get hurt and they fall in the lottery, and they're able to rebound and rebuild quickly because of that. So this is one of those situations. We got two teams, and they're both, expecting high lottery picks, but still lottery picks.
So if for the non-NBA people, think of when a star player is on a team, but he's kind of alone and they still have a off season, or that person gets hurt and they get another draft pick. A couple of examples would be David Robinson with the Spurs, and then immediately after Tim Duncan goes. Michael Jordan gets drafted in '84 and then gets hurt. I think he has a knee problem. It was also featured in the first or second episode of The Last Dance. And he gets injured, and that's how they are able to take Scottie Pippen in the first round a couple years later. So just a couple of examples of potential dynasties. That's how it starts, is you build one at a time. You don't have to draft everybody all together. You don't have to sign a whole bunch of free agents, which appears to be the new thing to do.
So when we get to the 1993 NBA draft lottery, obviously the Magic have the worst odds to get the number 1 pick. And the way the lottery works, because some people may not be, like you were saying, may not be basketball fans. In the NBA, it's not just straight up the worst team gets the first pick, second worst team gets the second pick, like it is in the NFL, like it is in Major League Baseball. The NBA and NHL have lottery systems. So there are a bunch of ping pong balls dumped into a lottery machine, hence the name. And they spit out 3 balls. The first ball is the number 1 pick. The second ball is the number 2 pick. The third ball is the number 3 pick. Then all the rest of the picks go in the way that you would assume. So whatever team is left with the worst record goes 4, then 5, and 6, and so on. Those ping pong balls are arranged by your record the previous season. Not quite as clear-cut favorites now because they're trying to eliminate tanking, but at the time, the worst team did have the most number of balls. In the 1993 NBA draft lottery, the Magic had the worst odds. 1.5% chance of winning the lottery. According to one article I read, they had just 1 ping pong ball in the entire apparatus, just a single ball. The Warriors came in not so bad, but the 5th best odds. So they were not, if everything goes chalk, they're not one of the teams who are going to get one of the top 3 picks. When they present this on TV, and it's really funny because there's a lot of conspiracy with the NBA draft lottery, and whether it's like rigged and they cheat and all this stuff. So by 1993, they made a big deal on the television program of saying, no one in this studio, including the commissioner, knows who won. There's this guy from this accounting firm. He's the only one. He watched. They did it. It wasn't even the NBA. They make a big deal about how secretive it was. They also reveal the picks in reverse order. So, for instance, they show the 11th pick in the NBA draft goes to, and everybody's assuming that it's going to be the Orlando Magic that they put up there. But it's not. It's the Detroit Pistons, meaning the Magic had jumped into the top 3. As it goes along, they reveal that the 3rd pick would be the Golden State Warriors, who came from outside the top 3. The 2nd pick would be the Philadelphia 76ers, who came from having the 7th best odds. And then the 1st pick was the team with the worst odds, the Orlando Magic. When you watch this, if you watch this on YouTube, the entire room is audibly shocked. Bob Costas, a consummate professional, he's just like unbelievable. He just yells it out. They're in the same studio, so David Stern does David Stern things, and he's like, believe it or not, it's the Orlando Magic. But at the same time, he's in that phase where it's like he's either thinks this is hilarious and awesome that you can't just lose and get the number one pick, or also maybe he's going to have the mob murder somebody over this situation. You're not real sure what's going on in his head, but that's how it goes. It is the worst odds a team has ever had to get the number one pick and succeed. It was at that time, and I believe still to this time, the only time that the entire lottery portion, the top 3 picks, now it's the top 4 picks, the only time that all of those picks were from outside the top 3 was this year. Just an absolutely crazy turn of events. But when you leave things up to chance, eventually you will get an outcome that is like this. So we get the Magic at number 1, despite almost making the playoffs. What do you make of that?
That's how these things happen, is by luck, by happenstance, by injury. Something, more than one thing has to go right. So in the 2 examples I gave, those 2 teams, the Spurs and the Bulls, got great, all-time great players. And then, well, for one reason or another, both of those just happened to be injuries. They ended up back in the lottery, and they got 2 more all-time great players. And that's how these things happen. They've changed the lottery system numerous times over the years for different reasons, trying to tweak it, trying to change it. Like you said, trying to prevent tanking. I'm here for the lottery system because those types of moments are things that we're going to talk about forever, right? That's why we're sitting here right now recording this episode, because 1.5% was all they needed to potentially set their franchise up for a long run of being good.
Oh, it sets up for a long run of something. So let's get to the actual draft and the actual trade. A lot was said about some of the players coming into the draft. This isn't one of the greatest drafts of all time, but there were some very good players involved in this draft. Pretty much, if you talk to basketball people whose role was not to get well, now we would say get clicks, but we're not to get paper purchases and eyeballs on sportscasts. If you ask people who were in the know, Chris Webber was pretty much the consensus number 1 pick. On that draft lottery show I was mentioning before, they also talked about Penny Hardaway as a potential top pick. Sean Bradley, who I knew was 7 foot tall and I knew was pretty good at basketball, did not know that going into this draft had not played college basketball for 2 years because he went to BYU and he was doing his Mormon mission. He hadn't played basketball in 2 years and was still being considered for the number 1 pick. They also brought up Jamal Mashburn, who solid NBA player, and a name many people won't know, Rodney Rogers, who is a Wake Forest legend. Was one of the guys pinned to be a potential number 1 pick. Just for the record, Sam Cassell, Nick Van Exel, Allen Houston, Byron Russell, Vin Baker are all players who featured in the 1993 NBA draft and who all had pivotal roles in 90s and some into the 2000s on NBA teams. A lot of this talk is misdirection. Teams are trying to convince each other of who actually would be. Maybe this guy's really good. You're sleeping on this. You're not seeing something in this guy. You're just trying to fool with people. We see this up to this day in the NBA and the NFL, especially with kind of back and forth here. The Magic, however, we're looking at Chris Webber because he's Chris Webber, one of the Fab Five. Probably the best player in the draft. It's written about that he's a power forward. He can rebound, but he also can dribble. He's got good ball handling skills. He can pass. He can shoot. kind of an early prototype of what we view as the power forward position now. And so they're looking at Chris Webber, but Rick Bucher of the San Jose Mercury News reported that Shaq, during the pre-draft process, called the Magic to say, hey, I know we want Chris Webber, but check out this dude, Penny Hardaway. They were filming the movie Blue Chips together, which is a solid 90s sports movie. Everybody should give it a view. But while working out during that process, he really kind of fell in love with Penny Hardaway and what he could offer. And so he called the GM, Pat Williams, and said, we need this dude. We need this dude. This is who we need. This is who I want. Get me this guy. And the general manager kind of agreed. He said, every good center needs a good point guard. And they were concerned about putting another post player with Shaq, even though Webber's not that kind of player. And even though we would see it later with, like you said, David Robinson and Tim Duncan playing in the post together, they were concerned about whether or not that would work. So they kind of shifted their eyes to Penny Hardaway instead of Chris Webber, but they didn't tell anybody that, of course. What they do instead is they know that the third pick in the draft, the Golden State Warriors, they've got a point guard in Tim Hardaway. They got a small forward in Chris Mullin. They got a shooting guard in Latrell Sprewell. You know what they could probably use? A power forward like Chris Webber. And so they talk to them and say, hey, look, here's the deal. You want Chris Webber? We know you want Chris Webber. We will be willing, we could be willing to trade you Chris Webber if the price is right. And this is, I don't know how you feel about it, but I know that I hate on NFL teams in particular. Like this year, we all knew who the number one pick was going to be. And it was just like, hey, are you picking this guy? And even like the day of the draft, they're just like, yeah, no, Trevor Lawrence, we think probably, yeah, but you know, it could be anybody.
It's absolutely absurd because the draft order changes so often, and they like literally the Sunday that the NFL draft is over, for example, someone puts out a way too early mock draft for the next year, and they talk about it all year, and it's just blah 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 blah. It's nonsense, and it's hard to follow because it changes so often. This year, we knew, for instance, again with the NFL, that Trevor Lawrence was going to go first, and they took almost the entire 10 minutes. Like, what in the world are you waiting on? We know what you know. You're not fooling anybody. Please just get that. Like, it's a 5-hour event in the first place. Just save us some time and take your freaking player already.
That's always how I feel about it. And like, I it makes me angry like that. But then you learn about something like this and you realize why, or like at least what they're looking at when they do this. So Pat Williams puts on a master class of subterfuge in this situation. So he has to convince the world, not just Golden State. He's got to convince the world that the Magic want Chris Webber and only Chris Webber, knowing good and well they want Penny Hardaway. Because if they convince the world that they want Chris Webber, Golden State has to pay up to get him. They have to offer everything they possibly can. He also has to convince Philadelphia, picking at 2, that they don't want Penny Hardaway. Because this doesn't work if Chris Webber goes number 1 and they've agreed to Golden State to trade him if they take Penny Hardaway, and then Philadelphia says, you know what, you guys are talking awfully a lot about Penny Hardaway. I think he is a good player. We'll take Penny Hardaway. Actually blows the whole thing out of the water. So he's got to convince everybody that it's Chris Webber. The newspaper writers in Orlando, if you go look at some of the articles leading up to the draft, they're talking about Chris Webber. The fans go berserk when they pick Chris Webber number 1. They boo Pat Williams almost off the stage when he appears at a draft party to say, hey, we're working on a trade. They boo him. But then they come back around and cheer again when they figure out that it works. So Everything works the way it's supposed to. Chris Webber is taken by the Orlando Magic at number 1. Sean Bradley went number 2. And Penny Hardaway was picked number 3 by the Golden State Warriors. And they immediately are traded for one another. But not just traded for one another, because the Warriors had to pay up. They get Webber for Penny, but also a first-round draft pick in 1996, a first-round draft pick in 1998, and a first-round draft pick in the year 2000. Now, hindsight being 2020, we know that 1996, one of the best NBA drafts in history. It's a good place to have extra picks. The 1998 draft, very good NBA draft, good place to have picks. We also know that the 2000 draft is the worst draft in the history of drafts. I think when I was looking it up, it is the only one. If you look at value over replacement, it's the only draft in history with a negative value over replacement for the entirety of the picks. Like, the NBA was worse for the 2000 draft. They should have just canceled it and moved on, and everybody would have been happier. But they didn't know this in 1993. And if you're wondering, why is it 96, 98, and 2000? Why didn't they? So the NBA has a rule that you can't trade your first round pick in consecutive years. So it had to be 96, 98, and 2000. From there, ladies and gentlemen, I've tracked this trade. It involves at least 116 players, 53 more trades beyond this one. And that's all with nearly 100 unfinished links for me to trace down. That is what happens because the one ping pong ball bounced in the wrong place at the wrong time. But yeah, that was the initial trade. Chris Webber for Penny Hardaway.
I'm excited to hear what happens. I mean, I have a good idea of like who they took, but like beyond that, I have not followed like you have. Chris Webber was definitely the best player in the '93 draft, based on what I know, and he was a generational talent coming out of Michigan, playing with the Fab Five and stuff. So hindsight being 2020, he averaged over 4 assists per game as a 4 forward in the NBA over 12 years, however long he played. So he was generational talent, runs, passes, shoots, rebounds. Like, he was it. I mean, he was the best player, but really only because Shaq wanted a point guard and not another big to compete against. I mean, I think Webber and Shaq could have worked really well, but if you know anything about this magic moment with Shaq and Penny, they worked out pretty good too. It's unfortunate what happened to Penny. His career got cut short because of injury, but they could have been really great. But I also think Webber and Shaq could have been really good for each other too.
I think Webber, in any different situation early in his career, would have had an even bigger career. I think he was a 4 or 5-time All-Star by the time he got to Sacramento. Five-time All-Star by the time he got to Sacramento. So I'm going to tell you guys about 3 kind of wacky, fun, interesting parts of this trade chain, kind of wings or branches of it. The first one I want to tell you about is Chris Webber himself. So Webber goes to Golden State. They have a good season. They played well, but Chris Webber does not get along with Warrior coach Don Nelson at all. According to Slam magazine, Nelson was a really old school hard-nosed coach in a time where that was becoming less popular. Obviously, it didn't become not popular because there still are hard-nosed coaches in the NBA that are successful, and there were plenty of them in the 90s. But for whatever reason, Don Nelson, who a lot of people thought was of as a player's coach at the time, just couldn't get along with him. Nelson's mentor was Red Auerbach, just to give you an idea of the mindset. And he actually gave a quote that says, "I didn't know how to coach, so I just did it the way Red did it." Right? Because that's my mentor. That's who I played for. That's the idea. That's what I got to do. Most of the sports writers, again, this is from the Slam magazine article, most of the sports writers in San Francisco and San Jose, the Bay Area, were unaware that the feud existed. They kind of saw some things go on, but they never heard about it. That's with the exception of one, Rick Bucher, who, if you watched ESPN in the 90s and 2000s, he became a big NBA reporter for them. He had made friends with Chris Webber, and so he kind of saw it coming. And it all came to a head in February of his rookie season in Charlotte, where against the Hornets, Webber comes down the court on a fast break and tosses a behind-the-back pass straight out of bounds for a turnover. And Nelson, being the coach he was, immediately calls timeout and starts yelling at him and benches him, and they have like a screaming match on the court because he didn't just call timeout and then get on him in the huddle. Like, he's walking to Webber and Webber is walking to him, and they have a confrontation right there in front of everybody. They also talk about how shortly after this, he's given a locker room speech. Nelson's crying and he's telling his team, like, if you guys are trying to get me fired, you're doing a great job. Like, he had lost his team that he had been successful with up to that point, all over this whole tiff with Webber. By the time the season was over, Webber asked out. He wanted to go anywhere but there. And he was given permission to kind of look for a trade on his own. We see this with players sometimes. Find a team that'll want you, that you'll fit in, and then we'll figure out how to make the pieces work. He eventually gets traded to the Washington, at the time, Bullets. And what did he get, you ask? Or what did they get in return? Well, the player they get in return is Tom Gugliotta. Hashtag Pack Pro. Hashtag Wolfpack in the house. Got to get that in there. Another relatively solid NBA player for a time. He had some issues as well. They also get 3 first-round picks. Blake, would you like to take a guess which 3 drafts the first-round picks came from?
Would it be the same 3 that they gave up just the year before?
He gets traded for first-round picks in 1996, 1998, and 2000. Not only that, but in the same offseason, just a little bit earlier, the Orlando Magic, who had Penny Hardaway, but also had Scott Skiles prior to that running the point, they decided they wanted to dump Skiles' salary. So in order to do that, Washington took on Scott Skiles' salary, but they needed something in return. The Magic traded their 1996 and 1998 picks that they had gotten from Golden State to the Bullets, and the Bullets turned around and traded that 1996 and 1998 pick back to Golden State. It is the same pick. It's not just the same draft. The 96 and 98 picks are the same picks that they had traded to get Chris Webber. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Webber essentially was traded for himself from Golden State to Washington. I mean, like, that already is unbelievable to me that like, it just full circle. They get their picks back. Now, the 2001 isn't theirs, but the 96 and 98 one are their picks.
How does that even it still boggles my mind just thinking about the things that could have happened with all this stuff. Like, it just boggles my mind thinking about how much dealing the NBA does with their picks. And I guess I obviously, they trade a lot fairly regularly, but I guess there's just not as many players in the NBA, so I don't know. It's this weird thing in my head that just like never made sense until I started thinking about like how many trades were involved in just this, what started into the 93 lottery and is still going beyond today. It's still hard for me to wrap my head around.
All right. So we're going to pause here for a moment and we're going to play all of our listeners' most favorite game show. It's 10 questions with Blake. And so we're getting ready to breeze past the 1996 NBA draft. So I just wanted to mention that there is a documentary either out or forthcoming about how good that draft was. They don't have if you start looking at some of like the advanced stats, there's some other drafts that have really top end elite, like top 5 player kind of talent. And that doesn't necessarily exist in the 96 draft, but they had 10 all-stars in the 1996 draft. And so, Blake, your question, 10 all-stars in the same draft is tied for the most all-stars at a single draft in lottery history. That's since 1985. Your job is to figure out the number 1 pick from the year that had the other year that had 10 all-stars.
Okay,
So you got to figure out the number 1 pick from the other year with 10 all-stars.
So since 85, the 96 draft had 10 all-stars. And one other draft correct. Since 85 had 10 all-stars. And who was the first pick in that draft?
That is correct.
Okay. How would I narrow this down? So if we what decade did this draft take place?
That's pretty good. 1980s.
Okay. 80s. Good drafts in the 80s, but since 85. 84 is out because allowed. 84 had Jordan, Olajuwon, Barkley, that group. So since 85. So it'd be 85, 86, 87, 89.
Those are the drafts in question, correct? Is that a question?
Sure.
Was that your second question?
We'll narrow that.
No.
That'll work.
No, that would be hateful. Yeah, I can't.
That's like taking candy from a small child. That's not fair. So down to 5 drafts. Not 84. What school? What college did? Is this a good question?
It's going to make it easier for you.
What school did that number 1 pick play for?
He played for the Georgetown Hoyas.
Okay, so then it would have been Patrick Ewing.
It is Patrick Ewing from the 1985 NBA
folks,
draft.
It's all about asking the right questions. If you ask the wrong questions, you'll never learn.
Yep, that's it. That's it. Georgetown's current head coach.
Oh yeah,
Patrick Ewing.
I kind of forgot about that. But they won the Big East this year, so I don't know why I forgot about that.
They did. Cinderella run to the winning of the Big East. Seems to happen in the Big East more than other conferences. We'll have to look at that, figure out why that is.
Future episode alert.
All right. There you go. So that 1985 draft also had 10 players who would make All-Star appearances. We're going to zoom past the 96 draft, and we're going to go to that 1998 NBA draft, because this is our second interesting thing. I know this is a big moment that me and Blake both remember from our youths that I'm getting ready to tell you about. And some of you guys know this, that you already can sense where I'm going with this, right? So the Warriors got their pick back from the Chris Webber trade for the 1998 NBA draft, and it would end up being the 5th pick in the NBA draft. The 4th pick in the NBA draft belonged to the Toronto Raptors, and this script is going to sound very similar. The Toronto Raptors were coming off their 4th season of existence, same as the Orlando Magic were in 1993, and they had a pick in front of Golden State, same as the Orlando Magic did in 1993, and the Warriors desperately wanted a power forward, a Naismith Award winner, Antoine Jamison. That's who they had their eyes set on. Now, the 1998 draft as a whole is a glorious and beautiful, like clustery dumpster fire. It is amazing to watch. There's good players in it. There's players that you know are good in it. There's players that like 11-year-old me at the time knew were good players that went in weird places. It makes no sense. The number one pick was Michael Olowokandi from Ball State. The reaction Blake just had, you can't see him, but he threw his hands up. That's the reaction of the general public in 1998. Nobody knew who he was. He wasn't
Holy.
good. He was out of the league quickly. It was why Clippers? Why? It was like
They're the Clippers, man.
They're
Clippers are
it
gonna
was
Clipper. That's all. I don't know how else to.
they were a train wreck. The stuff about this draft is incredible. Anyway, the Raptors general manager Glenn Grunwald firmly believed that Vince Carter was the best player in the draft, that Vince Carter was going to be the best player in the draft, and he wanted Vince Carter, but just like the Orlando Magic in 1993, he was very disinclined to tell anybody else this information, even though he was the general manager. His coach wanted Robert Tractor Trailer, which that's just a great name. He was another big guy, as you can tell by his name. And there were rumors going around. Toronto had kind of hinted that they were going to pick Antoine Jameson at 4 and trade him to Dallas, and as part of a trade, just to move things along. And they are going to again use the knowledge. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, we have NFL and NBA teams who refuse to tell anybody what their plans are. They use this knowledge that the Warriors want Jameson against them. So they leak this rumor that they're going to pick him and trade him to Dallas so that the Golden State Warriors, this time they don't necessarily trade a pick. This time they just straight up pay the Toronto Raptors to do the right thing in their eyes. So the way this goes is the Toronto Raptors do take Antoine Jameson, even though they could have taken Carter, who they really wanted. And the Warriors do take Vince Carter. Then they're traded for each other right there on the stage. They switch hats in the interview. It's this whole big thing. It's awesome. If you're wondering why they would do that, well, number one, they had convinced Golden State that they were going to trade him to somebody else. So they were able to get straight up cash considerations for the trade. But also, they now have to pay Vince Carter for being picked 5th instead of being picked 4th. The Toronto Raptors at that time were losing money. It wasn't the great North like it is now. They weren't NBA champions like they are now. They hadn't gained popularity by Vince Carter being there in the first place. So they were hemorrhaging money. So anything they could get would work out for him. This is interesting because this pick gets swapped around. This ends up being kind of a single unifying spot on this trade chain. It's not a great spot on this trade chain, but it is a unifying spot of this trade chain. If you're wondering if Golden State really did this same thing again, I got to tell you that Jameson was fine in Golden State, but his best years in the NBA were with the Washington Wizards after being traded. And if you're wondering, did they literally do the same thing 2 times in 5 years? No, they actually traded him to Dallas before he was traded to Washington. So he ended up going to Dallas, just like the rumor was, and just like Chris Webber, he ends up going to Washington. But it wasn't all the Warriors' fault. And of course, we know Vince Carter goes on to great things in several different decades. He invented himself several different times.
Best friends being traded for each other on the stage. They were already wearing their hats. Yeah. They were told about the trade, and then they swap hats on live television. That's how this actually happened. Being the Carolina person, it's really hard for me to believe that those two played together in college and they weren't like undefeated. But they both left as juniors, so I mean, maybe another year could have done it. But what a funny thing to happen! Like literally, college best friends got traded for each other. I don't think they ever played together in the NBA. But it's just funny that they swapped. But yeah, Jameson's best year is definitely in Washington, and he's actually in the front office for them today. Future Hall of Famer, NBA All Star, Antoine Jameson.
Calling
Bang,
a shot there. I see you. So now, this last segment that we're going to go into is the reason we are doing this episode. When I was researching this thing, the original catalyst for this was that the Magic had won this lottery incredibly. I'm just pulling back the curtain for everybody at home. But this next part is the part when I told Blake, we're doing this episode. Don't ask any more questions. Just be here and check this out because it gets good. So far, the trade chain has taketh from the Golden State Warriors. They struggled mightily after the Weber trade. In the 18 years before the trade, they had made the playoffs 6 times. That's not great, but it's once every 3 years. After the Weber trade, the 18 years after it, they made the playoffs just 1 time. The one time they made it, though, as the 8th seed, with head coach, who else? Don Nelson, was the time that they, as the 8th seed, upset the number 1 seed Dallas Mavericks in the playoffs off of a Mavericks 67-15 regular season. So that was a big splash. But if you're wondering how this went for the Warriors, this is how it went for the Warriors. Don Nelson lasted 2 years after the initial trade, was fired. Rick Adelman, who we should probably do an episode on, just kind of a criminally underrated good coach, 2 years and fired. PJ Carlissimo got choked out by Latrell Sprewell, 3 years and fired. Dave Cowens, who had done a great job with the Hornets before going there, 2 years and fired. With Jameson, by the way. Eric Musselman, 2 years and fired. Mike Montgomery, 2 years and fired. Don Nelson came back, 4 years, fired again. Keith Smart, for some reason, 1 year and fired. and then in 2011, they hired Mark Jackson. We know that the 2010 Warriors, we know that they did a lot of good drafting, right? We know that Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, Harrison Barnes on those early teams were all their draft picks. Draymond was one that they acquired through other means, but it was their draft picks. But there's one key player on those Splash Brothers teams that's not the product of their own drafting, at least not directly. So let's go all the way back to the 1994 offseason when Weber is traded for Tom Gugliotta and a bunch of other stuff back at the beginning. Strap in. This is going to be a lot of transactions in a row, but just strap in for a second. On February 18th, 1995, Tom Gugliotta was traded to Minnesota for a package that included Donyell Marshall. Donyell Marshall was then in a 4-team trade on August 16th, 2000 that involved Dana Barros going to Dallas. Dana Barros, a couple of months later, on October 17th, 2000, was traded from Dallas for Loy Vaught. Vaught was then traded from Dallas on February 22nd, 2001. This deal is cool because it involved Christian Laettner and Hubert Davis, if you're ACC fans. They all go to Washington. Hubert Davis then was traded by Washington to Detroit, along with a bunch of other players in a big trade for Jerry Stackhouse. There's another UNC guy, 9/11/2002. Jerry Stackhouse is traded to the Mavericks on June 24th with other players for Anton Jameson. We are
tearing it up right now.
On ourselves here. Jerry Stackhouse was traded again in a July 9th, 2009 trade that also involved Hedo Turkoglu. Remember him? Really great, a really good player. He goes to the Raptors. Turkoglu then gets traded again to Phoenix in 2010. He then was traded to the Magic in a package that included Vince Carter. Ended up playing for the Magic. I'm telling you, it gets crazy. That trade also involved a man named Earl Clark. Clark was involved in the 4-team mega deal that sent Dwight Howard to the Lakers. but it also sent Andre Iguodala to the Denver Nuggets, who then, in a sign-in trade, was sent to the Golden State Warriors. It is Iguodala who was instrumental in his first season there, being first-team All-Defense, 13-14, and it is Andre Iguodala, the sixth man in 2014-15, who, in the finals, was inserted to play center in a small ball lineup that got called the murder lineup that was crucial in turning the tide in the first of the trilogy against the Cavs that won them the 14-15 NBA championship. So they went through a lot of stuff, but it all came back around, and the Golden State Warriors got their stretch 4 or 5, and they won their NBA title. Just took them 21 years to get there.
Taking who they took in 93, and then, I mean, they took Chris Webber to potentially make him a franchise guy. Like, he was that good. Or he had that much potential, I should say. He had that much potential to be an all-time great NBA forward. And then through all the ACC folks, by the way, shout out to our home basketball conference, they just shuffled all the cards, and then eventually 22 years later, you said, they end up winning a championship off of that. Finals MVP in 2015, Andre Iguodala.
That's right.
You think about him getting blocked by LeBron James on that layup attempt in 2016, I want to say. But 15, Andre Iguodala locked down on defense and was Finals MVP off the bench for it. That's crazy. That's really cool.
It is. It's one of the fun things about like following one of these trains, and it tripped me out. Like, first I was excited because, like, seriously, we're gonna have to do something with this and come back to it later, because the people involved in these, like, just kind of branching off things are some of the biggest names. You could tell the story of basketball through the 90s and 2000s and 2010s with the people involved in these transactions. And so at first I was just excited about that, but then when I saw, like, one of the deals was Andre Iguodala, I was like, no way. And I was like, so I clicked on his page. Shout out to Basketball Reference, who has all these transactions for us to trace. I clicked on his page, and I was scrolling down. I was like, please be one more trade. Please be one more trade. And then it was there. And it was incredible. It was incredible. And just to show how long and how far this goes, Iguodala is not on the Warriors anymore because he was traded to Memphis in 2019. One of the things involved in that trade is a first-round pick in 2024. This thing isn't over because we still have guys that are not yet in the league who are part of this deal. That means that there is at least one player who will be playing in 2025, 2026, because first-round picks have 2-year guaranteed contracts. So a guy's going to be playing in 2026 as a part of this trade. But wait, there's more. Because as I'm researching, a 2026 second-round pick is involved in this. That's as far as it goes. So this thing may not end for another 10 or 15 years. There has to be another trade that you can trace like this, but this one is just incredible to me. And to my knowledge, nobody's talking about it. Nobody like recognizes how far it goes. I think in part because the NBA does just trade so much stuff that it's hard to keep track of. But shout out to that one ping pong ball that has caused chaos for decades. I can't believe it.
Not to say that Iguodala still would not have ended up with the Warriors at some point, but
Right.
it is funny that the way that it started in '93 between Orlando and Golden State, and how Golden State thought they had everything, right? They thought they had Weber. Like, they thought they had a guy who could be there for a long, long time with a good coach. Like, Don Nelson came back and took the We Believe Warriors in the mid 2000s with Baron Davis and Matt Barnes, question mark, to
And Monte Ellis.
Yeah, right. It's just funny how this whole thing circles, and there's probably more stories like this, and I want to hear them. But there might be, I'm sure there has to be some sort of like real long-term circular type thing. Like, they thought they had their future. They were terrible for so long after Weber. He basically murdered 3 franchises in his NBA career, to be fair, because the Bullets went on a playoff losing streak after he left there also, and the Kings had they could have been a dynasty. I don't know. I don't understand how they're not, because they led the league in scoring and shooting and so much stuff multiple times. They almost beat the Lakers at one time, but
it's incredible. It's incredible. And I don't know another word for it. It's just incredible that it starts from nothing. It starts from nothing. Like, if the Magic pick 11th in 1993, like you said, there's no saying that some of these things don't happen, but they don't happen in this order, and they don't happen this way, and there's no telling. It's one of those things where, like, a small change, right? It's this whole idea of the butterfly effect in the first place, right? A small change at the beginning of a sequence of events creates a gigantic change the further you get down the line. And in this case, it was from having nothing to actually having everything. So
very cool.
That's what you don't know about the trade that never ends. We might come back to this one multiple times as we dig deeper into who went where and when and why and how. And so you may see more content from this trade. If you enjoyed it, we'd love to hear from you. If you got another idea, we'd love to hear from you. Hit us up on social media. And thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of What You Don't Know About Sports. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please leave us a review, 5 stars only please, and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen. If you have a great sports story, we want to hear about it. You can connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WYDKAS Podcast, and on our YouTube channel at What You Don't Know About Sports Podcast. All episodes are written, recorded, and edited by us. Stay tuned for the next episode.
Harold Davis makes an appearance in this week's episode.
Harold Davis?
Wait, and who's the coach at Carolina now?
Hubert.
Whatever, that guy.
Hubert Davis.
Hubert Davis makes.
I was about to Google
Harold Davis. Who was Harold Davis?
Try and figure out. Harold Davis. Harold Davis is an American photographer. He played tennis. Harold Solomon. Nope, that's not it. Anyway.
That's not even the same name.